Thank you also, Sarah Rose, for that really generous introduction. It's always it's lovely to see you again, and it's also really exciting to be in a group of people that are thinking about climate in such a positive and active, sort of hope-making way. I'm really glad to be here. I also appreciate how much breathing has happened in this room already, and I'm going to ask us to do this one more time. What I would really love to start out by doing is if everyone can close their eyes if that feels comfortable. I invite you to do that. Maybe if that doesn't feel comfortable, you can just rest your eyes with a soft gaze somewhere, maybe towards the ground. And imagine we're through this period of Imbolc. The weather has warmed up, the trees maybe have started to leaf out, and the first spring rain is starting to fall on some dry ground. I want you to take a deep breath. And I want, if you can, to conjure specifically the way that this smells. What is the smell? And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Yeah, so most of us have a really positive association with that smell. Does that feel true for folks in this room for the most part? Yeah, so there's actually a specific name for this, and the name for this is petrichor. So this is a pair of chemists in the 1960s who were interested in exploring this phenomenon. Initially, they were just interested in the chemical compounds, in the terpenes and the creosotes released by the impact of water droplets when they hit the Earth, thinking about Earth as this sort of crossroads of the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, the geosphere, the biosphere. But the name that they chose for it, petrichor, belies the kind of bewitching quality of this, right? They created a neologism using two ancient Greek roots, petra meaning something that's made or associated with a rock, and this idea of ichor. So ichor is a mythological substance. It was supposed to be the blood that coursed through the Greek gods that kept them alive forever, right? So you can think of petrichor as representing this sort of lifeblood of the earth, named by a couple of chemists. Soil can be that beautiful, that bewitching. So that petrichor is one, I think, really poignant moment where soil really kind of rises up to meet us as human beings, as a species that's so rarely looking down, or maybe one of the ways that we become kind of alive to soil in a different way as the living, breathing, really vibrant ecology that it is. Interestingly, one of the terpenes that they isolated, one of the chemical compounds that they isolated is called geosmin. Further studies showed that human beings are incredibly sensitive to the smell. So the average person can detect geosmin, one of the compounds in petrichor, in 5 to 10 parts per trillion. That means that most of us can detect soil that's ready to receive seed more accurately than a shark living in the ocean can smell blood. So this is hardwired into us, this connection to the soil. Soil is also front and center in a lot of climate conversations. If you're in this room, I'm guessing you know that, right? Thinking of soil as second only to the ocean as a carbon sink, thinking of soil and its role, and healthy soils and their role in kind of cleaning our water and our air. But today I'm kind of less interested in thinking about soil instrumentally as a sort of frontier for extraction or as a potential carbon sink, and actually more interested in the ways that soil in some ways kind of uniquely holds this opportunity for us to build a different kind of relationship to the more than human world. In my mind, if we can feel awe in something, in the face of something seemingly mundane as soil, and I think we probably should, it's not so much that soil might save us, but that we actually might save ourselves by renewing this real awe in front of the systems that support us. So if there's really kind of one takeaway I would love for you to have at the end of today, it's to sort of stop thinking about soil as this inert, static object, and really to start to see it as the living, breathing, kind of mind-bogglingly complex ecosystem that's really worthy of our respect and care. One of the things that's so compelling to me about soil is its proximity, right? It's something that most of us who live in Durham, if we choose to, can come in contact with every day. but also this idea that it's this vast unknown, this wilderness that we actually know very little about. So if I were to ask, what is soil? One simple answer is like, we don't actually really know. One of my soil mentors, a professor of soils at UC Santa Cruz, used to say that we actually know more about the surface of the moon than we know about the average garden soil. There is something also really deeply mysterious in the fact that healthy soil is actually 50% air, which means if you're standing in the middle of a forest, a healthy forest, half of what you're standing on is actually nothing at all. It's just empty space. There's a kind of Zen koan quality to this. Soil is one of the most complex and oldest ecosystems on Earth. So if you think about up to 10 billion microorganisms per gram of soil, that means there's more organisms, more individuals in a teaspoonful of soil than there are people on the Earth in one teaspoon. And when you start to think about all those organisms interacting with all of the other billions of organisms, it gets pretty mind-blowing pretty quickly. Less than 1% of these organisms have actually been identified or studied. And very few of that 1% have actually been successfully reproduced in a lab. So these two things are related, right? We can't study them because we can't grow them in a lab. To me, that means they're sort of so interconnected and so intertwined that they actually can't survive in the kind of individuating petri dish conditions of a laboratory. So we can think of soil as being sort of everything all at once. It's living and it's dead, it's animal, it's vegetable, it's mineral, and it involves these multiple time scales, sort of the more stately geological pace of mineral life, of sand, silt, and clay, and then also this churning of these trillions of beings that are hunting, eating, breathing, moving, dying. Those organisms kind of reach back into the earliest days of the Earth, the sort of primal world of Actaea, of fungi, of actinomycetes, as well as into organisms we can see. We can think of the earthworm as a sort of charismatic megafauna of the soil ecology, and also into our presence and our futures, right? Soil is holding increasingly the microplastics that we have created that will be with us potentially forever. If half of healthy soil is pore space, sorry, this is kind of blurry, but the other kind of half of it is basically this mineral skin of the earth. This is rock in various states of wear, sand, silt, and clay, as I mentioned. Given its sheer bulk mass, we can't actually do very much about these underlying mineral components, but we can create the conditions for their rearrangement by working with just a very modest volume of soil. So of this organic material, I mentioned between 0.1 and 0.15% of that is actually alive. So the rest of this, 5%, is basically dead or decaying matter. So we think of the total volume of soil, 0.1% of this is actually the engine that's making this whole system go. So every terrestrial being is really relying on this really minute component of soils to do the work that the rest of us need to survive, to make space for us and for the living things that we depend on. So what feels so, I don't know, strange and uncanny about this for me is that it's not only making life from life, but seemingly making life from non-life, right? From the earth itself, taking something that's really inert and making it lively, working across species and kingdoms, animate, inanimate, invisibly, insensibly, at this sort of baffling scale. So why are we actually not more in awe of this? Why do we, in fact, barely even notice, right? The majority of us don't know ourselves. If we live in an urban setting, most of us actually never come into direct contact with it. In some ways, we have the French to thank for this. If you imagine Paris, city of light, right, these wide boulevards. This was the master plan of a French urban planner in the 19th century, Georges-Eugène Haussmann. So a lot of people know that those wide boulevards were in part to exert control over the population in the aftermath of the French Revolution, right, and popular uprising. The other part was to accommodate this sort of modern or so that this newfangled idea of a widespread sewer system. Another piece of that was the sidewalk, right? So the sidewalk paved over the kind of dirt and dung that had been, up until that point, an accepted part of city streets. Obviously, that has a huge positive impact in terms of general hygiene and the decrease in communicable diseases, but it really cut us off from this fundamental aspect of our living. And that we've come to see this rupture, to see this separation as actually a hallmark of modernity. A hallmark of the modern city is being cut off from dirt. Soil is something we try to avoid, right? We reject it. We reject its traces on our skin, on our clothes. We fear literal or figurative contamination. We're sort of afraid of this mess that we've made. And even for those of us who consider ourselves gardeners, myself included, we're rarely actually working with soil. Most of us think nothing of going out to the store and just buying somebody else's soil, sterilized in a bag. In fact, when we talk about this, we talk about it as soil improvement. But more often what we're buying is actually a manufactured soil product. So this is sort of the horticultural equivalent of Cheese Whiz. It's not something that's sort of this organization of friendly bacteria. It's an industrially assembled kind of grab bag of component parts that's meant to sort of resemble the original. When you look closely at a bag of potting soil, you'll see some ingredients that might surprise you that are kind of constellated from far and wide. Things like perlite in the middle and vermiculite. These are both minerals that are open pit mined for the most part, sometimes in the United States, sometimes further abroad. And they're basically like the rock equivalent of a Rice Krispie. They're superheated up to 1100 degrees Fahrenheit, and that expands those rock pieces. It's a very carbon-intensive process. Peat moss also, you probably know, this is something that's mined that releases a lot of methane gas, a very potent greenhouse gas. And then biosolids, including actually in organic topsoil. You might see biosolids, you might see it passed off as compost. This is human sewage sludge. And in many ways, it's actually less the human waste that I find more disturbing. It's everything else that goes into our sewage system, right? Everything from Drano to PFAS. These are things that we actually pay for the privilege of smearing all over our growing spaces. It's counterintuitive, and yet this is something we continue to do all the time. And I get it, right? The soil that we have here is rough. There's a reason why the early Durham industry focused on things like brick making and pottery. Right? These are things that our soil is great for. Before I came here to North Carolina in 2014, I had farmed mostly in Santa Cruz and in the northeastern United States. I not jokingly, say that I was totally unaware of my soil privilege. When I came here and encountered these soils and realized that I was responsible for growing food in them, I literally cried. My family is here, they will tell you I am not a crier, so that was very unusual behavior for me. It's really possible to change these soils. So this is what the native soil looks like, or one example of our native soil at where I farm now at the Duke Campus Farm. We've been farming there since 2010. I can pass some of this around. And this is some of the soil that we're working with now, which I can also pass around. So what I want to say is that we should really stop talking about our soils as bad, I do this too, and maybe start talking about them more as sensitive. These are sensitive soils. These are clay soils, the kind that we have here. So look at this scale, sowing needle, gravel, sand, silt, clay, invisible at this scale. So it's a little bit like asking a kid, giving one community, in one soil community, and you ask them to build a house for their own well-being, and you give them a stack of breeze blocks, right? Nice, airy, solid, porosity. and you give the other community and tell them to build a house out of toothpicks, right? They've got these tiny little things to work with, and they're doing their best to make it work, and it's hard, right? And soils at their best can be some of the most productive soils when they're treated really well. I think another maybe a more relevant question in terms of thinking, in terms of recognizing like that our soils are so weathered and eroded is why? Why are they this way? If for some crazy reason you wanted to go out and dig an 8-foot pit in your backyard, it would probably look something like this. What you're looking at here is Duke's resident soil scientist, Dr. Dan Richter. He's taught me so much about soils. This is a pit that he dug behind our farm, basically to teach soil pedology, soil formation, and the concepts of soil horizons. So soil horizons, what that means is you can see kind of soil naturally falls into these layers that are a kind of co-creation of geology and then also the soil biology. He also told me that the missing O and A horizons, if there are any soil nerds out here, basically the reason that we have no topsoil has to do partly with our underlying geology, right? We're standing on some of the oldest soils on the planet, but also human podologies, human impacts on soil, meaning that 3 to 4 missing feet of topsoil is essentially the result of plantation agriculture. And we're never going to get that soil back. So, sorry, what I mean by that is when I asked Dan, okay, we know that the Duke campus farm was settled by first experienced white settlement, I guess in 1754. We had the deed for the land. Where would 1754 appear on this timeline? And he basically pointed up to this yellow line right here. So that is soil that, again, is gone. It's in our gullies, in our oceans, in our watershed. And with this topsoil, the traces of the displaced and the enslaved who lived and worked where we are now. So as a culture, just very broadly speaking, we've taken an unspeakable amount from Piedmont soils. And it adds insult to injury that those of us who've benefited from the soil exploitation, including myself, right, who work for institutions that have, can then turn around and call the soil bad, right? It's a hard reality. So more and more I'm thinking kind of in my work about soils, about the memory of soils, about the archives they hold or don't hold, and both their sort of past, their eons of heavings, collidings, weatherings, along with these more recent human pedologies of erosion, toxification, and potentially regeneration. So here's a picture not in the middle of a soil pit. This is the Duke campus farm. A couple members of our field crew are here in this room, and some of my coworkers. So this is their work too. It's also the work of trillions and trillions of organisms that are arranging and rearranging these sort of ruins of the Plantationocene, like these tiny little architects making homes for themselves and others. And so they are working also in turn with thousands of volunteers, with about 25 student crew members per year. So I recognize this is not like most farms. We have a lot more elbow grease, a lot more eyes and hands and hearts in this acre than a lot of our neighbors, and we're very grateful for that. But I'll tell you some of the things that working on a campus farm has taught me. First is that soil making is a skill that we can learn. So every year we work with about 25 students, most of whom have never really thought very hard about soil before, and we help turn them into soil makers, soil keepers. The other thing is that this work doesn't have to be on such a huge scale. We're farming an acre that's about the size of a football field, and we're growing enough produce for about 150 families, about 20,000 pounds of food. And if you imagine the average suburban lot is 1/8 of an acre, there's a lot that could potentially be done with that. I'd say another thing is that you don't have to own something in order to steward it really well. I'm really annually, like seasonally, really amazed and inspired and touched by how much dedication, how much blood, sweat, and tears people pour into this place that none of us will ever own or actually directly profit from. And I would say that it's easy to lean into a kind of pastoral fantasy of this. I fall prey to it sometimes myself, especially potentially within the confines of an elite institution. But I would also say that industrial agriculture is equally fantastical, if not more so, right? In their ideas about feeding the world, I think is a popular slogan in commodity ag, but I think it ignores a couple things. One, that most of the things that are grown in commodity agriculture, most of us would not recognize as food. And then the other piece of it is that a third of the food that is produced is actually wasted. So feeding the world, maybe we can start to think more capaciously or maybe more literally, rather than thinking about feeding people, thinking more about feeding the world at large. I also want to point out that it hasn't always been this way. So Sarah has kindly mentioned that I am an early modern scholar by training, and when you look at literature from 17th century England, from the period that I study, in that time and place, the more common word for growing food wasn't farming, it was actually manuring. So you would manure a piece of ground. So that comes both from what you think it comes from, and also this idea of manus, right, the hand, working with the hands. So thinking about this idea that up until the Industrial Revolution, people didn't farm, they manured. And what feels interesting about that to me, farming, as you can see in its etymology, has this idea of extraction. It's a fiscal or a legal transaction, like you farm a latrine in the 17th century, meaning you dig it out, right? You cleanse it out, you get rid of the stuff. Whereas manure has this idea of kind of working with the land and enriching the land through the spreading of manure. And it's that enriching that actually has this implication of the appropriateness of being there, right? It's through this enrichment that you earn your right to say that you dwell, right? That you rightfully occupy the place. It's not from farming, right? Not from extraction, but from this idea of actually giving back, and giving back over time. What feels inspiring about this to me is that I think often there can be a displacement or a kind of mourning or a sense of guilt or shame or a sense that other non-Western traditions have a lock on sustainable agriculture. But I think one way of looking at this is that sustainable agriculture is actually a universal tradition. Some of us just forgot it longer ago than other folks. And one thing that means for me also is that all of us have a tradition to reclaim, the sustainable agriculture tradition to reclaim. So when I think about this in relation to what I do now, thinking about farming where I farm in the southern Piedmont, as in all the places where land has been abused, is this sort of idea of coming back to these places that we've ruined, either individually or collectively, and practicing the arts of repair that many of us know or knew, or many of the people around us already know. And I think that this is work that we'll need to learn how to do more of as we compromise more of the planet and its soils. When I think about other non-renewable resources that I use, like lithium or fossil fuels, like I don't know how to make those. But I have learned how to help other organisms make soil. And that feels really exciting to me. It's so pleasurable, right? Soil is so wild and so near, and something that I'm really interested in kind of building more a relationship with. So how can you do this if you don't have 1,000 students and a 1-acre farm? So this question is just, how can I befriend my soils? A lot of us have them. And I just shared some things that I've learned through the last 25 years or so of working with soils. Feel before you work, aerate, inflate. That's especially relevant for those of us here in the Piedmont. Feeding your soils, maintaining the integrity of your soil horizons, keeping your soil covered, emancipating yourself from monoculture, and then building this relationship. So feel before you work. Has anyone read like any of those weird like clickbait posts about how many bacteria are in your kitchen sponge? So that's like not what we want on our dishes, but actually you can think of that as the reason that's so such blaring clickbait is because bacteria love this exact kind of environment, the moisture of a wrung out sponge. So when you're thinking about going and working in your garden, you can just grab a handful of soil and feel it. Does it feel wetter than that? Does it feel drier than that? If it doesn't, stop. Don't do anything. Take a break, take a walk. I don't know, figure out something else to do. But if it does have that just right moisture, that means that your soil is ready to be worked. So you can think about that petrichor again, right? That's what's happening here. That's what you need to do. Aerate and inflate. So I meant to bring one of these tools in, I forgot. This is a digging fork. You could use a pitchfork. I worked with a community garden in Brooklyn for a while who would just go routinely to the Salvation Army and buy stiletto heels. Great, you can just, these are, what we want to do is, what you're not seeing here is a spade, right? A spade, like a diamond head thing. It's designed to move soil around. This is really just designed like the stiletto heel or the pitchfork to create macropores. So the tool works vertically more than it does diagonally or horizontally, if that makes sense. Thinking about adding organic matter, this is a really beautiful cover crop that grows really well here in the Piedmont, crimson clover, leaves. That's actually a bad illustration of that. This is a better illustration, right? Just leave it where it is. You can think about making compost. It doesn't need to be fancy. You can just bury any kind of organic matter in a thin layer underneath the ground. You don't have to buy a super expensive large plastic tumbler. You can consider vermiculture if you don't have any outdoor space. I lived for probably over a decade with 10,000 very low-key pets that were earthworms. They lived in a box in my kitchen. They made beautiful soil. It allowed me to come home every night and just have my very own petrichor. You'd open that box and just, they're beautiful. Maintaining integrity of soil horizons. That's maybe kind of a jargony term. I mentioned that soil kind of naturally, or soil geology and soil biology and soil chemistry to combine to create these sort of layers that you can see in the soil if you dig down. The soil microorganisms, plants, minerals, etc., have worked really hard to create these horizons. So what you don't want to do is what your average tiller does, which is to flip these. So as much as possible, we want to aerate soil without reversing or flipping or disrupting those layers. Thinking about emancipating yourself from monoculture. So our obsession with the lawn can also be dated back to the period that I study. This is an example of a 17th century British estate. This works really well in Britain, especially if you have sheep. There's really, it's this sort of strange kind of unconscious, I think, cultural obsession that makes us want to replicate this in really strange and untoward other ecologies. For example, where I grew up in the Central Valley of Northern California, which is very hot and dry. The other thing about this landscape is it's associated really closely with enclosure, meaning this landscape is also representative of the period where people got pushed off common lands. These fields were enclosed for these animals right here, and essentially, started capitalism and climate change. So when you think about, if you were to think about transitioning your lawn, you can think about kind of emancipating yourself from a very colonial and sort of privatized commodity orientation towards land, towards something that maybe would be both like easier on you and potentially less resource intensive. These are some of the ways I think about kind of building relationships with soil. Here's a really beautiful painting of soil microorganisms. And I would just want to, and I said in my title that I was going to talk about growing food. And that's because I think some of us may want to just befriend soil for soil's sake and think of soils as really beautiful and lovely. I've come to that understanding myself. But most of us, myself included at times, will ultimately lose interest in what might feel like a kind of one-sided relationship. One thing about growing food, or really anything that you find pleasurable, it could be native plants or flowers or meadow, it's a way to kind of feel into this reciprocity and feel like you're receiving something that you enjoy back. You're putting a different kind of skin in the game and maybe having access to more delight. But so growing food or any plant really, to me, one thing that it can do is change our relationship to the invisible, to the non-human networks of care that are around us. And the reason that I say that is because when we think about growing food, growing food, it can fall into the same sort of transactional relationship, right? I'm caring for you because I want you to do this thing for me. Namely, I want to kill you and eat you. Whereas when we're thinking about soil, we're doing two things. We're actually caring for the system that's caring for the plant. So I was trained in agroecology, and a lot of people who come up in that school or in regenerative styles of farming really think of themselves as soil farmers or micro-herders. You're growing a soil that's going to, in turn, support healthy plant communities. But the other thing about it is it's sort of disrupting this more transactional mode of care, right? You're creating the conditions for thriving for this network that then indirectly is going to support this other thing that you need. And that, I think, can feel really nourishing on a bunch of different levels. Again, you could easily say this is sort of a pastoral fantasy. It's also really dirty work. And from my perspective, if the pastoral fantasy gets you through the dirty work, I could think of worse things. So, in sum, I would say the way that we've been farming and working on soil is showing its limitations, right? It can no longer provide real living conditions for the planet as a whole. So we need to reimagine ourselves and sort of evolve ourselves from being soil consumers into soil community members, maybe even soil makers. Because we all, whether we're doing this deliberately or not, are makers or unmakers of soil, and we're all capable of repair.